must remember to clear my throat before I come up here. President Brian, Rotarians and guests. Many of you know Gerald now, I remember. Gerald is in New Zealand, although he calls himself an Australasian. Lives in Australia and comes to New Zealand. It's absolutely forbidden to talk about that sport that we really don't want to talk about today, being Australian, but we'll present a graphic view of the last 15 months of earthquakes. Those earthquakes that shook the beautiful city of Christchurch. Okay? He's going to illustrate and describe dramatic consequences of the 15,000, it's an amazing number of recorded quakes. I'm sure it wasn't 17,000. Basically, I just really want to set the scene a little bit before Gerald comes up here. But just imagine hopping in your car one morning, driving up North Terrace or William Street, and having roadblocks on both ends of North Terrace, on both ends of Rundle Street or Rundle Street, and then what's the next street? Bartels Road. There's all roadblocks all the way around the city. And guess what? We cannot get into the square mile of Adelaide. Okay? That's what Christchurch faced. Imagine banks. Yeah, the doors are locked, but all the glass is gone, and there's millions of dollars of cash sitting beside those banks. Imagine the security issue. Imagine just not being able to go to work. I know there's a bunch of guys or girls who work at my place who basically, they didn't come to work tomorrow. I wouldn't be paying it. They wouldn't be able to pay the rent and all these things. So there's a huge amount of implications of an earthquake the size of what Christchurch had. So, Gerald, I'm welcome to the podium to tell us a bit about it.
Well, thank you very much for that great introduction. You could almost have given the rest of the talk. However, let's have a go. Firstly, thank you for inviting me, and I'd like to address Brian, Rotary Chairman, fellow Rotarians and guests that are here. My talk today is not one where I could say, well, it's a great pleasure for me to give this talk, because in many ways that's it's somewhat of a sad story that I'm going to unfold, but I think it's one which is worth putting across. I was going to say to you all, how many have been to Christchurch amongst the gathering here? A lot. Perhaps how many haven't been to Christchurch? Well, I've got some sad news. It's not the same city that the others might see. However, as you'll see through my talk, Christchurch is still alive, it is surviving, but it's been really, really badly bashed. My talk is really going to be centred around a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm going to move fairly quickly through it. I'm going to touch on the factuals, some of the more traumatic scenes, a little bit of humour, some of it you might say is almost black humour, and end up explaining some of the sort of more technical and engineering issues without getting too bogged down, because I know I've got time against me. So with a bit of luck, this will work. Page 2. There's been a whole new vocabulary in Christchurch. One of them gets used a lot. Such and such is munted. And you might say, well, where did that come from? It actually is in the dictionary, and it means bust or broken. So Christchurch people talk about things being munted. They talk about such and such being gone. Well, that means it's been demolished or it's fallen down. And so there's an interesting new vocabulary that the Christchurch people have coined. My wife and I went into Christchurch twice in the last 12 months, and I'll touch on those as I get to each point. A little bit of history. Christchurch was settled in 1850 quite formally by an organised settlement from Britain. 4 ships set sail from Plymouth and all arrived for Christmas in 1850. My great-great-grandfather amongst them as the ship's doctor. He then proceeded to become an artist, and he actually owned a house which I wish I knew that I owned the land of now, because it's just off the Cathedral Square, and these are some of the scenes from his time. Christchurch really is a beautiful city, and again, for those that have been there, I'm sure they'll recognise some of those scenes. Some people say it's more English than English. There's another view of the city, and yet another. And I'm going to come back to pointing out something more particular about that rock that's standing up in the estuary there a little later in my talk. Well, New Zealand actually is in a bit of a nasty position, and it's certainly true that it's on a major fault line, and you can see there the quite strong illustration of it. and up the top is the illustration of the world's tectonic plates. Australia luckily sits on its own, but we'll come later to the point that even you've got earthquake faults. So Christchurch sits actually away from the main alpine fault that runs all the way down through the Pacific and is really dividing the Pacific plate to the Australian plate. And these two earthquake plates are kind of diving underneath each other. And it's certainly true that it's part of what has been loosely called the Ring of Fire, which spreads right around Indonesia and right around to South America. So you'd have to accept that Christchurch is a bit on the edge of earthquake zone. This chart here shows the quakes, some of them small, some of them large, over the last 20, 30 years, and it highlights, of course, that Christchurch was in the middle of the great ones. The chart behind me, I don't know how they got figures back to 1843, but supposedly it shows the very big ones, magnitude 6 and above. But Christchurch really hasn't featured, they're mainly in the North Island, which incidentally is not really proper New Zealand. The South Island of New Zealand is the mainland. Just put a little bias on it. Now this is an interesting chart because for the last 4 or 5 years, there's been very few earthquakes around Christchurch. Anything within 50 kilometres is shown there. And yet, look what happened after September 4 last year. And later in my talk, I'll just show you how luckily the frequency and the magnitudes are abating. But things really went absolutely berserk from the first quake 15 months ago. So this is the scoreboard, as we call it that. Christchurch has had well over 15,000 quakes. The significant ones are 3 and above. I think when I come to the slide about the order of magnitude, you'll get to know what I mean. But certainly 5 and above, they've certainly had a lot of quakes, nearly 60 of them. So it's not like just one big earthquake and everything settles down. Christchurch has been continually hammered with quakes. Over the last 150 odd years, there have been large earthquakes. I can remember 1 or 2 of them. The last 3, of course, have been the last 15 months, but certainly there have been others that have caused significant damage. I could talk about each one in turn, and that would be a talk in its own right. But it does show you that it is in a rocky sort of a place. Again, a little bit of history, and I think the key point that I'll make again is that Christchurch actually is not on the main fault line, but back in the 1890s, the cathedral lost a little bit of its top spire, and there may well have been some damage to some of the brick buildings back then. But really, that's about all Christchurch can say in the last 150 years. I think the spire of the cathedral got reclad and built a bit more robustly, but of course, as you'll know, it took a hit in this most recent round. So, yes, September, 15 months ago, luckily early in the morning, it was a Saturday morning, Christchurch got hit by a 7.3 quake, which was only 30 or 40 kilometres to the west. It was shallow and it did a lot of damage. Again, people say, but Christchurch doesn't have a lot of earthquakes. But whoopsie, it really did, and that just shows you the magnitude of the recordings of that quake. So I'm going to go through a few slides just to illustrate some of the scenes that I've been able to get a hold of. Everything went berserk. Daylight struck. People couldn't believe what they found. This is a church out at Hororata, west of Christchurch, pretty close to the epicentre. That got very badly damaged. Lovely old church. One of my cousins was the vicar there for many years. This beautiful old house, the Dean's Homestead, again, very close to the epicentre, pretty much annihilated. The before and after scene. There's another shot. And this house would have been full of antiques that were never able to be recovered. Gerald, Mrs. Dean's, I don't think it's a very happy lady there. So a few more scenes of the damage, and remembering this quake was out of town by 40 k's, but it was a wacky. You can see there that cars were taken out, buildings completely fallen apart. Here's a before and after of a typical sort of 1920s building, not reinforced, and I'll touch on that later. Just completely fell apart. You can see the people's bedrooms or what was left of them. Here's some scenes of twist and damage. That chimney had to come down, and in actual fact, there are very few chimneys left in Christchurch. They've all been fallen down or taken down. This one, of course, took itself down. And there, that illustrates the kind of energy that was expended. I mean, to do that to land, let alone the railway track, is pretty darn considerable. The University of Canterbury's library, I suspect they hadn't bolted their library shelves down because they didn't need to, but look at the mess. Here's some more scenes of damage from that September quake. And as you can imagine, these buildings will well and truly be pulled down by now. That's an interesting scene. I think the cat didn't know what it was sitting on. Huge, huge land dislocation. I mean, over here, that was a straight road. You can see how much it's moved. You can see how much the earth has opened up in some of these shots. And again, the next one, you can see there, a complete line of trees has just been nudged sideways. So huge amounts of energy expelled from the 7.2 quake. It really did shock people that even the inner city roads got badly cracked up. Some more scenes of the damage back in that first quake. We've got a house that we still rent out over there. I don't know why we kept it, we should have sold the darn thing. But you can see there from the back, see the lovely tall chimney, and you can see what happened to it. It completely crashed down. Part of it bounced onto the roof where the tarpaulin is and landed on the balcony. We dug a rather big hole in the balcony. There was superficial cracking, but luckily that was all. So yes, that's finally been repaired. Next quake, not well known, was one just on Boxing Day, and a lot of people were out shopping in the city because I think they recovered fairly well from that first quake. Nobody was killed. It was early in the morning. There was nobody out and about. But yep, they then had another quake, 4.9, and they did have some moderate damage in the CBD. Just looking quickly at the earthquake scale, and some of you will be familiar with the Richter scale, but it's not sequential. Every time you go up one unit, it goes up by an order of 10. So when you go to a 7, that's ranked as something that is pretty rare and pretty extraordinary. Admittedly, the Japanese earthquake had an 8 or a 9, I don't think they know which, but that is about as big as you could get. Christchurch, though, at 7.2 was very significant. Below 3, you're not going to worry too much. So this Richter scale, people get confused. Oh, it's a 4 earthquake, but boy, when you go from a 4 to a 5, that's a big change. And a 5 to the 6, that's even more significant. This is a chart that I plotted up that shows from records I got the amount of energy that comes from each Richter scale quake. And it says here that a 6 is equivalent to the Hiroshima, but if you go to a 7.2, that's equivalent to 35 Hiroshima bombs. And admittedly, America has much bigger bombs than that, but it gives you a bit of an idea of the explosive power that must have gone under the ground. So, Christchurch didn't expect more earthquakes. They thought the December quake was enough. It got hit by a 6.3, pretty much bang centre and very shallow. And that's the one that did most of the damage. And so I'm going to talk you through some of the scenes. I mean, this was taken from the hills, and interestingly, most of the dust and everything is coming from that downtown area and moving to the east. And there were a lot of the western suburbs which really went too badly touched. My sister and my family, some of my family live out towards the airport. And by and large, the houses were a few cracks, fences fallen over and so on. So just looking at the sort of things that we can say happened, the February quake, there were over 180 people killed, a lot more injured, 1,500, some serious, a lot of damage to commercial buildings, thousands and thousands of homes with various forms of damage, some completely uninhabitable. So yes, there were some homes totally destroyed, and we'll go through and have a look at some of those pictures. Huge amounts of damage to roads and bridges. Liquefaction, which I'll talk about and illustrate, that was a major problem in some of the areas of Christchurch. Land shift again occurred. A lot of Christchurch sewers were completely munted, we'll pick up that term, and I think there's some areas where they're still using portaloos today. There was certainly a lot of other problems. When we arrived there was a shortage of food and fuel. There were queues for the petrol stations. A lot of houses had lost their water supply or it was contaminated, so the city had to have a huge amount of water supply. Very quickly, the CBD was cordoned off. Schools were closed. Some actually had to double up, so they had schools from 8 o'clock till 2 and then from 2 till 7. Huge amounts of damage to sporting stadiums, and I'll show you some of that. Massive damage to the older churches and heritage buildings. But on top of that, there was a lot of personal problems, family grief. People lost their jobs if they had them in the CBD, and the CBD just closed down. Tourism was obviously very badly affected, and people really were emotionally stressed, and as much as anything, that's continued because the quakes didn't stop. So there's been a huge amount of problems. I'm Royal Christchurch didn't get to host some of the games of the World Rugby Cup. So that's a map of Christchurch. The star is where our house is. The white star is where our daughter's house is, and I'll show you that. The blue star is where my sister lives and my 93-year-old mum is. And the circles, they were the areas which were badly hit. This is my daughter's house. It's wooden, it survived pretty well, but the chimney had to come down. Where she's standing in the driveway there, she normally parks her car, but the neighbour's chimney came down and she thanks her lucky stars she didn't have her car there. So when we arrived, the power and the water were off, everything was off, kitchen cupboards had fallen apart, doors had moved. There's probably only about $20,000 worth of damage there, but most people have way more than that. Just down the road, and this is the first scene of some liquefaction, and I'll show you some more, but that car was pretty much swamped by it. That chimney came down. In fact, I whipped down and grabbed the guy to come and take my daughter's chimney down. With my sisters, they had a lovely bottle of ruby port, and that crashed down. Her swimming pool, a third of the contents got smashed out and through the living room. Our house that I spoke of, well, that lost the top of the next chimney, and that's since had to come down. This is a view from our home there. Next door neighbour, his chimneys are all gone. But actually, you can still see there's a lot of houses standing, so it's not like everything's gone. Here's a view of the city, and I've got an arrow pointing to the Grand Chancellor, 26 stories. That's being demolished at the moment. It got on a lean, very modern building. I'm going to flick through these fairly quickly. Yes, there were deaths. A lot of trauma. Huge rescue effort. People came from all over the world in Australia. A lot of sad stories, and I don't have time to read them through, but there was an exceptional amount of grief where people did literally get buried and lost alive. Christchurch Cathedral, a real icon of Christchurch, and that's the before scene. It really is a focal point for the whole city. This is views inside. A beautiful, not a huge cathedral, but certainly a beautiful one. But that's what happened. It lost the bell tower. There were 20-odd people apparently there. This is some more scenes. And inside, a complete utter shambles. But miraculously, they didn't find any dead bodies in the base of that bell tower. Quite where those people went to, I don't know. The Catholic Cathedral, a beautiful image of a Roman Catholic Basilica. I think they may go to try and save it. These are some more scenes. Munzer building, but the church is fine. This is what it looked like when we were there in July. We went back and spent 3 weeks there. The Pine Corporation building, a 1960s building that completely collapsed. My brother-in-law watched it from his office. Literally happened. So people were killed in this, and obviously big questions about its construction. The one that really did cause the most damage was the failure of the Canterbury TV building, and that's what it looked like, and then afterwards, and obviously half the total deaths and more. Grief everywhere. This young student had to have his leg amputated just to get him out of the rubble. This guy got rescued alive. This is an analysis I did of the people that died. I see there was only one Australian. I don't know where the rest of the Aussies were. A lot of young people, people from overseas, tourists and the like. Obviously a lot of Christchurch people, but certainly people from many parts of the world. So for the first 2 months they spent nothing but trying to clean up the refuge and look for bodies. Cars got fairly badly treated in this earthquake. Even car park buildings collapsed. So it wasn't a good day to take a car to town, as it turns out. But there was huge amounts of help. They even had a group called the Farmy Army, and people from all over the Canterbury area came in with their wheelbarrows and trucks and so on. People from overseas, the Japanese flew a group in. Liquefaction, a lot of people don't understand, but if the ground is shaking that hard, it literally turns the water and soil into a fluid and it flows to the top. And you can see that rubbish bin, it's just about buried. Cars suffered with sinkholes, really quite dramatic scenes. But it was a massive clean-up job, and it didn't just occur in this quake, it occurred in other ones. Humorous, but there's free sand. But there were hundreds of thousands of tonnes had to be collected off the streets, not from this quake, but others as well. I don't know how the person got out of that car, I must admit, I haven't learned. So cleaning up the liquefaction, particularly in key areas, was a massive task. And even the dead were, I think, woken up because tombstones are gone and more liquefaction.
Gee, I wouldn't have got that hole.
Lovely icon of Christchurch called Shag Rock down towards Sumner. Pretty much annihilated. Yeah, this house is obviously a bit of a mess. This guy had to watch his house, but had a lot of damage in September, but in February they compulsorily demolished it. Some more houses that really are complete wrecks.
Are the insurance companies going to pay out in this claim?
I'll come to that, that's a good question. House on the bottom left, well, that was bare land when we were there in July, so it had already been taken down. These will all be taken down. Tile roofs took a beating, brick houses took a beating. These were houses on the hill, and these huge boulders literally bowled their way down through the house and out the other side. The other one lodged in the middle of the house. And you can again picture the amount of energy to dislodge these rocks. My old school, that survived reasonably well, but Harbour House, which is a day boy house, got its cloister badly damaged. I was in this boarding house, we couldn't get in when we were in there in July, they were already doing repairs. You can see the snow on the ground, which was there in July. My old rowing club, munted. 2 sports stadiums, I think they're all going to have to come down. Rugby Park and QE2 Park. Poor old brewery got closed. And statues took a bit of a tumble too. And scenes of more damage. People got killed in buses as they were travelling in that February quake. Churches took a real hiding. We saw this one. We used to go to this church quite a bit out in Merivale. They had to pull the tower down. Presbyterian church, that's what it looked after straight after the quake. A church in Littleton, pretty much on the epicentre, and I know this vicar very, very well. He had the most lovely old church, just it'll be flattened by now. And Littleton, of course, was a real mess. I know these two very well. This church is pretty much now demolished. Beautiful old church. This we used to be on my way to work every morning. People just took up and pulled it down because they saw it as a danger. Across the road, I love the old restaurant which we used to go to. That's about to be demolished very soon. Catholic church down at Sumner. I think that'll not survive. Wooden church, that did survive, interestingly. Some of the old provincial council buildings and such like, badly damaged. My wife's not very impressed as we were there in July. She just walked. around the Arts Centre and close to the square, that's Ridges Hotel, that actually survived very, very well. The interesting thing is that this new art gallery, all glass, became the main control command centre for the earthquake recovery. More damage. People ended up having to be put up wherever they could. This tanker couldn't get through from the port because the port road was closed. Lovely old pub we used to go to, 100 years old, that's gone. Yeah, bowling alley. And then they had another hit in June. The cathedral lost its window, finally, and that's what it used to look like. Out in the suburbs there was a huge cliff and those houses are gone. Our daughters used to go to the school up on the top right there. More liquefaction. And this area of the city that's still closed off, and these two buildings on the other scene, they're going to have to come down. So it's a ghost town. Fashion Mall, a lovely centre for shopping, completely got cleaned out. But in a scene or two, they've actually restored it. They've got shipping containers and people have been allowed back in. So there is definitely recovery going on, but a lot of demolition. This hotel, that's condemned, and they've let the tenders to get that. A little touch of humour. Go on the top, tested to 7.1. They had to distribute hundreds and if not thousands of portaloos because people's toilets weren't working. I'll flick this one through, but this is friends whose house is condemned. They've been living in a caravan ever since. And this picture in the middle is the carpet with all the muck and grime growing. The Earthquake Commission looks after the first 100,000 of every claim, and you pay X amount with your insurance policy. So they've been having to handle all of this. More houses to come, or more buildings to come down to the CBD. And I guess the real quick message I'll show you is that the big problem was unreinforced materials. And this chart shows that those that survived the green and those that didn't survive are the red. And you see unreinforced buildings really didn't stand a chance. So good buildings stood and others failed. And when they failed in a big way. The swimming pool literally popped out of the ground. The beautiful convention centre and theatre, that's completely closed. But this building was reinforced 2 years ago, and we went and had a dinner there. So Christchurch as it was, what it looks like now, and buildings still to go. Cathedral's been deconsecrated. They're going to have to demolish bits of it. The bishops, the deans resigned, and there's a hang of a row about what to do about it. So fault lines discovered everywhere, and they really didn't know where they were going to be. But this chart shows that the quakes are abating, and thank goodness for that. And this chart very quickly plots by month quakes of different levels and the amount of energy. So those 3 quakes, September, February and June, were the big hits. There's still a risk of some more quakes, but here's the outcome. And the price for recovery has gone to 30 billion, they say, and they're still counting the cost. But they're now starting to plan recovery. The Earthquake Commission has got a plan ahead. The Royal Commission findings are out for people who want to look at them. And people even got back into the square to have a look briefly. So things are looking up. But just to quickly close, this town's also had an earthquake or two and could in the future. And I think if they got hit by anything like what Christchurch did, I'd really say we have a mess here. So Australia does get some earthquakes. And we sit on a thin skin on the glob of molten rock in the middle of the earth. Rotary has been a huge help, and even in April there was huge amounts of money, and it's still flowing in. So Rotary worldwide has made a massive help in Christchurch. So this is my last slide. It's actually, Christchurch is not far away. It is a sister city of Adelaide, and it's not that much further than Darwin or Perth. So, it is in our space. and I've probably run over time. Thank you.
Please thank you.